Hello, today we are going to talk about the cult of the true womanhood, or otherwise known as the cult of domesticity. And this is going to be pre-reading for our short story we will be reading, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And it'll also give us a historical context or background knowledge about women and men and gender roles in the late 19th century. So an overview. In the 19th century, women were mainly confined to the role of domesticity. They primarily took care of the home and the children. These roles were necessary to promote a woman's proper role, and these were strict guidelines for how women should act according to societal standards and expectations. During this time period, there was also a lot of etiquette books that were created, and these were the main sources of what women would read, and a lot of these etiquette books were written by men, so they were telling women how they wanted them to act, and they reinforced the ideas of the woman's role in the domestic home. So life in the 19th century. So to give you a little bit of background information, the Yellow Wallpaper is set in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, and during this time period, people's values were changing frequently. Their fortunes rose and fell at alarming rates. There was a lot of social and economic mobility that provided instability but also hope. During this time, there's been a lot of literacy movements in early America. And first they talked about the Puritan or the colonial era where your fate was determined by God. It was heavily religious and everyone was saved by Christ or God. If you think of some of those sermons of fire and brimstone, that would represent the Puritan idea. Next we came the Age of Reason, where people were more interested in logic, scientific reason. That's where a lot of new technologies and discoveries came about. And then after that, we had American Romanticism, which this Yellow Wallpaper was created in the Dark Romanticism. The regular Romanticism talks about beauty of nature, using your imagination. There's hope in individuals, and there's optimism for the future, which then translated into Dark Romanticism, or known as Gothic literature, which is pretty much the opposite of American Romanticism. And Gothic literature was like pessimism for the future, a future that was unknown, the threshold of the demonic or the insane, the potential for evil. So because of all these time periods and their shifts in values and focus, that's why people's values were changing, the fortunes rose and fell, and there was a lot of social and economic instability around. So since life was changing so much, the women's role was also beginning to change. So gender roles in the 19th century, we've got men. Men were mainly working on building railroads, bridges, and they were working long hours to create the infrastructure that we have now. They didn't have as much time devoted to religious practices like any of the time periods before because they were so busy working. And a lot of the time the women had to pick up the slack of the men, especially in the religious pursuits. However, women in the 19th century were basically considered hostages in their own homes. They were primarily caregivers for their husband and children. They cooked, they cleaned, and they kept a happy home. If you look at this picture right here, it's using a little verbal irony. It's okay, I didn't want a real life anyways. So the roles of women in the 19th century were confined to about 4 different roles. And women must follow these characteristics. They must be pious, they must be pure, they must be submissive, and they must be domestic. Pious means they must be religious. Purity is relating to moral ethics, choosing between right and wrong. And submissive is being at someone else's will or doing what other people tell you to do, especially men or husbands. And domestic means taking care of the house and the home and the children. If women didn't follow these roles, a lot of times they were condemned or shunned by society. So it was very important for them to follow these roles if they wanted to fit in and not cause too many problems. So we're going to talk about the first role, piety, which again is being religious or being guided by spiritual or religious beliefs. And what this meant was men thought that piety was a source of a woman's strength. So the holier they were, the better they were. And a lot of times men were told to find a woman who was pious. And if the woman was pious enough, everything else would follow. So she would be a perfect wife if she was pious. Uh, Not only do women have to be pious for themselves, they had to be pious for their husbands who were busy working. So if they weren't able to pray as much, women would have to do double time to pray enough for themselves, their children, and their husbands. Women also had a big burden on their shoulders. They were expected to bring the world back from sin. And one of the main reasons for piety being one of these main characteristics women had to have was because religion didn't take women out of the household. It didn't make them want to be more independent from their husbands. It was something that they could do where they could engage in religion, but also be the housewife and the caring mother and wife that their husbands and society wanted them to be. And a lot of times they were saying not being religious was too awful to contemplate. So it was something that was very important to a woman, her role, and the way other people would view her. Some quotes that define a woman's role as pious: no sensible woman will suffer her intellectual pursuits to clash with her domestic duties. Women were warned not to let their literacy or intellectual pursuits take them away from God. So how dare you have an interest besides God, religion, spirituality? And a lot of people said religion is exactly what women need. Without it, she is ever restless and unhappy. So there's no purpose in life unless you are religious and you take care of your husband and children. And the last one, it is better to pray than to think. We could stop and discuss these now. The second role that women were expected to take on was this role of being pure or purity, which is showing high moral standards, values, and virtue. What this meant was women had to maintain their virtue related to gender roles. So they had to stay virgins, they had to act modest around men, they had to act ladylike. However, this was pretty much a double standard because men were not held to this same standard. They could act the way they wanted to, and no one would say anything. Women were the ones that had to uphold this virtuous and pious nature. This idea of purity also sets up this catch-22 because a woman must preserve her virtue until marriage, so she must not have sex or be promiscuous in any way. And marriage was necessary for her happiness. Everyone thought women had to be married in order to be happy, and that's what society wanted them to be. But at the same time, marriage was an end to their independence and innocence. So after marriage, they would have to do whatever their husband said or wanted them to do. So it was this big catch-22. How can women get out of this trap? Oh. Some of quotes that defined a woman's role as pure is, without purity, a woman is unnatural and unfeminine. And death is preferable to the loss of innocence. These are some pretty bold statements here, so let's take a second to discuss these. The third role that women were expected to uphold was this role of submissiveness. So you're conforming or obeying the authority or will of others. Mainly in this sense, women had to obey men, their husbands, sometimes their fathers. So the idea of being submissive is all about being passive. Women are dependent on men for every aspect of life except for the home and children, and even then men would tell the women how they wanted their house ran. Women were very timid. They were never to talk back or question their husband or any man. And you can definitely see this when we read the Yellow Wallpaper, where her husband sometimes may condescend her or put the word little in front of her to kind of downplay her own importance. He calls her a little goose at one point. Mainly, the whole idea is women must obey men. Whatever men says goes. Some quotes that define a woman's role as submissive is, if women tampered with the man's role of dominance, they tampered with the order of the universe. So that's very dramatic. She does what she can, but she is conscious of her inferiority and therefore grateful for support. So women should be supportive to their husbands, and they should already know that they are inferior to their husband. Females should become little children and should avoid a controversial spirit. So a controversial spirit to me would represent disagreeing or argument in some sense. And there we see that word little in front of something. And a woman is supposed to resort to being a child who has to listen to their parent, just like a woman would have to listen to their husband. And the last one, women are expected to suffer and be silent under suffering. So even if someone was suffering, they need to take that suffering with grace and pretend they're not. And we will see that in the yellow wallpaper as well. These are some pretty bold statements, so let's take some time to discuss. The fourth role that we're going to discuss is domesticity. And this is related to running the home, taking care of the children, domestic roles or jobs. And this is the most prized characteristics by those women magazines and books on etiquette of the time. You can see some of them right here. How to behave and how to amuse is this one. And etiquette for ladies. A lot of them talked about how to treat men, how to amuse men and laugh at their jokes and keep a clean house and raise proper children. And so the reading that women were allowed to do pretty much reinforced all these gender roles and these stereotypes that society wanted women to follow. Duties, bringing men back to God, comforter and role of nurse, patience, mercy, gentleness. So women had to be all of these things to be considered a woman, a real woman in this time. And women were supposed to keep busy with morally uplifting tasks like housework, looking pretty, and taking care of the children. I'm not sure how morally uplifting these tasks are, but they're certainly domestic tasks. Some quotes that define a woman's role as domestic. Even though women love literature of the time period, she should avoid them or choose moral ones because women are susceptible to persuasion. So we don't want to be tricked by all those persuasive means out there, so we shouldn't be able to read or have our own minds. It's a pretty bold statement, so let's take some time to discuss. So finally, women's rights in the 19th century, 1800s are probably a little different than what we think they are today. So from this article about the cult of the true womanhood, they say women's rights referred to the right to love whom others scorn, the right to comfort and to mourn, the right to shed new joy on the earth, the right to feel the soul's high worth. Such women's rights God will bless and crown their champions with success. So instead of rights, their own rights, or women's suffrage, the right to vote, or having independence, having a mind, having opinions and ideas, these were the things that society wanted women to do. And they definitely are related to those four roles of, piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And so a woman's basically like a yes sir type of thing. Even though there was all of these rigid stereotypes that women had to fall under in these gender roles, this was also a period where time and change was coming. Women in the late 19th century started to, one, fight for something more, and thus began the spark of change. So what women wanted was a bigger role in society. They wanted to be intellectuals. They wanted independence from their husbands and fathers. They wanted to have actual rights. They wanted a purpose outside of the home, and they wanted to vote. And all of these things would be coming shortly within the next 20 to 30 years. And in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, we will see and identify these rigid gender roles that we talked about in the slideshow and the problems that existed as a result of these gender roles. So hopefully you learned something today, and this will prepare you for reading my favorite story ever, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Thank you, and don't forget to do your journal prompt that is associated with this. Make sure you have the slideshow out while you're writing so you include all the needed information. Goodbye.